thank you everyone and welcome. We appreciate you joining us today. I am very privileged and pleased to introduce Erik Luysterborg, who I've had the privilege of working with when I was formerly a principal at Deloitte. Erik was, and still is, I'm sure, for the people still at Deloitte, the go-to person in Europe around privacy topics. And formally he is the leader within the Europe, Middle East, and Africa around when I was formerly a principal at Deloitte. Erik was, and still is, I'm sure, for the people still at Deloitte, the go-to person in Europe around privacy topics. And formally he is the leader within the Europe, Middle East, and Africa around the topic of privacy. But more than that, he really has just assembled the team and network and is the person we turn to work through topics. So I'm really excited to have you here today, Erik, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Welcome.
Thank you very much, David. Appreciate it.
So why don't we quickly outline the format? If we could move to the next slide, Sarah. The focus of today's conversation is going to be to discuss a very specific topic where EU privacy laws really collide with operational security issues for companies. And what we're going to talk about today is understanding really the employees' rights from a European context and frankly how that impacts a company's ability to monitor and control their own networks and access to the internet. So as we get into this topic through a series of question and answer, there's going to be an opportunity for the participants today to contribute direct questions for a Q&A. So please don't hesitate even now to, as audience members, to queue up specific questions in the chat window that you have, and we will reserve a significant portion of time at the end to allow you to have direct questions for Erik as well. So the format will be, we've got a few slides framing a couple of key questions as we dive into this topic. So with that said, and no further ado, I'm going to move to our first question. So Sarah, if you could progress. And Erik, you can really more broadly talk about privacy requirements. The specific question to start us off is, what rights in a European context do employees have to a private life in the workplace?
Well, if you compare to the US, for instance, it's basically the reverse. It's kind of in the US, when you as an employee join a corporation, your email traffic is considered to be kind of almost provided to the corporation, and there's not much kind of expectation of private life, so to speak, or of kind of privacy with respect to email traffic. That is kind of totally reversed in the EU, where you have basically kind of three layers, first of all, of type of legislation. You have kind of the EU layer, which is currently the EU Directive on Data Privacy and the EU Electronic Communications Directive. Then you have national levels, where you have national labor law, which is definitely not harmonized at this moment in time. And then you have something that's called collective labor agreements, which is sometimes sector-specific and sometimes general, where, for instance, specific topics of surveillance and so on are being handled. Today, if you look at the rights that EU employees have, is that jurisprudence or courts have kind of decided that you cannot kind of prohibit an employee to use the email system of the corporation for private use. It can be limited, of course, but the employee will have a right to sending personal emails, and those will be protected as if it was a normal correspondence. So that is really kind of in a very, very short, in a nutshell, kind of how it is considered as a general rule in Europe.
Well, so let me expand on that, because you mentioned specifically email, and I want to draw the distinction between the corporate email system and, let's say, the employee using internet access to get to various types of webmail, like Gmail. Do the rules change between an organization's corporate email and webmail? Do employees have, essentially rights to get to the internet?
They have rights to get to the internet. The corporations, the companies can limit that access. They have a right to, but it has to be proportionate. So this means, for instance, they could say, we will not allow kind of football matches or Big Brother kind of type of access, or porn sites or whatever. They can either make it blacklist, or they can make it very difficult, or they say you don't need it for your job, so you won't have access to the internet on that. So they have some power to decide on that. It has to always be proportionate, but it has to be very transparent. That's in general kind of the rule with respect to access to internet.
And then I guess along these lines, I'm gonna, we have a question up here which just says, does any of this, is any of this in play in the conversation around moving from a directive to a regulation, or is this topic area pretty stable in that respect?
Well, it's pretty stable in this sense. The regulations, the draft regulation that is coming up, does have a section at this moment in the current draft, because remember, this is still a moving target. It has a kind of an elaborate section, but basically it is kind of even more detailing things that are already out there. So let's give you an example. It will state, for instance, that consent in the employee context with respect to surveillance and so on is always going to be considered kind of in a subordinated version, so you cannot always rely only on consent. It has to have a legal framework, or it has to be kind of in the labor agreement included. The regulation specifies things like you will not make any surveillance in certain areas such as bathrooms, etc. Those type of things. So it basically elaborates and specifies things more with respect to this. It also allows for current local, so the national collective labor agreement, the national labor laws, to exist. It leaves it up to the member states to still decide if they kind of permit private use, for instance, of emails in the workplace. So in that sense, it is not really going to have a big impact with respect to the current regulations with respect to privacy in the workplace. It will make it a little bit more, what it will do is, and this goes through the whole regulation, it hammers on two basic principles, and that is transparency and proportionality. So basically it means kind of whatever you will do on surveillance, or whatever you will do with respect to security monitoring or whatever, you will need to be very clear both to works councils as to the employees themselves what you're going to do, why you're doing it, how long you're keeping it, and with whom you're sharing it in what instances. So that won't change, and that even will be more explicit, will be rendered more explicit. So also, you will need to, and this is a privacy by design and privacy by default principle, when you develop systems, when you develop tools to monitor or to surveil, to make the surveillance for security, you will need to demonstrate that kind of what you're doing is not over the top, or that it really serves a purpose. So, in other words, kind of continuous monitoring, just on the off chance that somebody would do a fraud or would do, send out an email with too big an attachment or something with sensitive information, will not be allowed. However, if there would be kind of proof or indications that a employee or a certain department is leaking information, that would allow in itself to kind of start a certain monitoring within certain boundaries, but you can start your monitoring actions.
Interesting. So I appreciate that. It sounded like, with respect to the regulation and the transparency, that works councils are still going to continue to loom large, that the companies are not they're not getting away from that, having to negotiate arrangements and get approval from the works councils. That's going to still be there.
That is entirely correct. I think, and we've seen that so far as well. It always depends in Europe as kind of which country you're talking about, but the usual suspect countries, in that instance, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and here and there a few smaller countries where this has a big impact, you will need to either kind of get authorization or inform them well in advance of what you're going to do. And they will have that possibility to either stop you or to ask very detailed questions. So a good relationship with your works council, and also, again, to be transparent with them, is still going to be necessary.
So let me move forward a slide here, Sarah. And I think what's part of the basis, or what led to this discussion for us, was that we find that employees' use of the internet is a real security challenge for organizations. That I'm sorry, Sarah, could you move back? You advanced to an extra slide. That much of the malware that we wrestle with inside of organizations, that many of our data breaches and leaks come from employee internet access originally. And yet, and now maybe you could move forward. I don't want to spend too much time on this data, but we'll make these slides available afterwards. On the EU side, as we started to discuss, and Sarah, if you could advance to the EU slide, as we started to discuss, and maybe I'll take a second here in case, Erik, there's anything that you feel is overstated or understated, but that there are essentially some privacy protections, it sounds like here, around individuals' personal activity in the workplace. And that protection isn't going away. And so I guess with that, it leads me to our next question, which really comes out of some of my personal experience with companies and consulting with companies, is that these privacy protections seem to impact the ability for companies to implement security practices. And I specifically have run into the DLP deployments globally, which tends to focus on endpoint monitoring, or deep packet inspection of SSL traffic. Have you, Erik, found that companies have had challenges balancing their desire to implement security practices to monitor with the Works Councils kind of feeling like it invades their right to a private life in the workplace?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is where kind of, as we call it, or I like to call it, the security privacy paradox comes to the forefront. Security is basically tying somebody's identity to his or her actions. In order to secure something, you want to know what they're doing, or what is happening, so to speak, in order to be able to kind of either have an advance warning or to manage any possible incidents. Now, the more you tie, of course, somebody's behavior to his identity, the more you retain privacy. So this is one thing. The second thing is what I just said on the protections that exist under EU privacy law. It is specifically gone to email for personal use. Now, of course, here is the devil in the detail. How are you, in reality, it's not that employees make very neatly kind of, this is a personal email in the subject title list, and this is a corporate email. And even if they would do that, then of course, you could see already somebody going to fraud doing it under the personal heading. So these type of things, kind of in reality, make it very difficult for firms to kind of, put effective data leakage prevention or incident management kind of tools. There are solutions. and again, it comes always back to using a little bit of common business sense and sometimes the proportionality rules, in the sense that, for instance, you would ensure that whoever is monitoring or whoever is the group that is doing the monitoring, that it's not too many people who have access to that monitoring agenda. You would in specific circumstances, you would have the four eyes principle, all of these type of things. However you do it, a lot of the tools that exist today, they either need to be adapted or they need to be kind of accompanied by specific procedures and processes when using that tool in order to not run foul of these privacy laws. But it is a challenge at this moment in time, especially because you have all the rise of the cyber threat vis-a-vis, the right to privacy. And we have seen indeed, I'll give you one example, which is a very silly one, but kind of where somebody, that this was in Poland, wanted to use in a warehouse biometric access codes and tools, and the Data Protection Commission found that too kind of invasive for the purpose it serves on that. So you're going to get into these type of, this is not email, this is not instant management, this is the type of kind of level of detail you get into, and it's a very ad hoc, it's a very kind of local, at this moment in time, country-specific view that you need to take.
It's interesting, and I want to take a few extra moments because for our U.S. companies, this is all often quite surprising because in the U.S., with a well-crafted, acceptable use policy and, essentially forget about informed consent, you know what I mean, or, consent freely given. I mean, if you basically hired them on and you put them through the training, you can sort of do whatever you want in the U.S. by and large. And so this idea that there might even be any constraints around how you monitor your employees is sort of it's sometimes hard for companies that are U.S. based to even get their hands around, right? So do you find that it's a different challenge for you when dealing with your U.S. companies operating in Europe?
In some ways, yes. I think some companies are better kind of informed or have a better feel about it, but in some others, it's really still something new. And because it goes sometimes against common sense. I give you another example. There used to be an issue where somebody who kind of, when they have to enter a company, had to kind of slice through their access card. And it was always said that this was just to know who was in the building for security reasons. But they found out that somebody was always late through that use of that card, that he was always late and was the first to leave. And they fired that person. This was in France, based on that. However, because of the system was never notified to the council or to the employees as saying this is also a time-stamping thing, that was overturned and they need to pay damages to the person. This is just to give you an idea what you're up against in some cases, where the person, nobody was saying he was not late or he was leaving early. It was just the fact that this kind of the whole system was not kind of being notified properly. This is the same thing. This is the challenge you're going to face, and also sometimes the power of works councils on this with respect to kind of when implementing data leakage protection prevention tools. It's not impossible, don't get me wrong, because it's also about the right, as I said, transparency policies, and it's not that they will block anything automatically. It is just something that needs to be kind of told clearly, and sometimes procedures needs to be adapted. We had cases where somebody kind of the monitoring was done on the European employee was done out of the States, and but what happened was where they had notified that, but didn't notify that it was going to be a whole department in the States, and that department was sending them emails to their employees saying, "We have seen that you did A, B, and C. Beware, if you do this one more time, there's going to be a disciplinary action." And the employee was kind of furious that it was not his HR person that informed him, but somebody outside. And that detail was left out when this whole system was laid out. These type of things is
one of the things that I really grabbed onto was in that story of the card, what you have is sort of an unintended consequence or an unintended learning that came from data collection that was going on. And I think it's interesting to me because so much of what we are investing in our security technologies is now moving towards data collection and analysis, right? I'm going to look for behavioral patterns, anomalies, and behavior out of the ordinary. That these types of sort of big data or data collection based sort of analysis is a lot of directionally where we're going to combat developing threats. And it's as you mentioned at the beginning, security is a lot about binding behavior to identity. And so it sounds like in some ways it's a challenge to our security technology providers and our profession to figure out how to address security without unnecessarily invading individuals' right to privacy. Although I don't think a lot of our security development focuses that much concern on the privacy piece of it. So we're sort of increasing dramatically our knowledge of individual behavior. And so I wonder if we see this as becoming an increasing challenge in sort of how these EU privacy requirements collide with the expanding tools and techniques we have on the security side. I would guess this is a growing challenge and not a shrinking one.
That is correct. It is definitely not, I want to be very clear, it's not an insurmountable one, but it does require holistic view. And the problem we've seen with in many organizations is that you still have a kind of a siloed approach, I call it. It's the kind of old notion that security is technology and privacy is compliance or it's policy. And it's a bit of both. And you need to kind of, it's the old people, process, technology kind of thing that comes to play here, which is kind of, you need to have both. But it is important to realize that you can have you need security to get to privacy. You don't need privacy to get to security. And that is becoming a big kind of important kind of item to take into consideration. Because yes, big data is there. It's on we're seeing the pilots, and big data is not necessarily bad. Big data can also be used for security purposes. However, one will need to be very transparent and explain in advance to people, in this case employees and councils, of why you want to do this in that circumstances, or why do you need that information. And if it is, for instance, it's a typical thing like in Europe you had a number of cases where in the past you would ask somebody before you hired them kind of a proof of good behavior. It was something you got from the local police station if you weren't having convictions. You're now not anymore allowed to ask that unless, for instance, the person has to work in a vault or with money or with whatever. So it's a little bit this type of thing when you're going to kind of implement monitoring tools, that you have to ask yourself how proportionate is this? Am I using a cannon to kill a fly, or do I really need a cannon because it's such kind of a widespread threat that is coming my way, and we will have to kind of shrink privacy a bit in order to get to be safe against those threats.
But it is a challenge for us, because I remember in a conversation I had once with the Data Protection Authority in France, the CNIL, and it was back to the example you gave about email. I mean, when you start to do what these tools do, which is over-collect, right? We're doing these substantial collections and then looking for the needle in the increasingly big haystack. The privacy impact sort of becomes this inadvertent and accidental thing that keeps happening, right? That, where do the lines get drawn? It gets sort of, I just, in that example, the email tagging wasn't considered sufficient. So even if you only, looked at a fraction of a percent of the email that triggered an alert, if inadvertently one of those emails happened to be personal in nature and a human being reviewed it, it seemed like that was problematic for the regulator. And I guess my question really is, can you have broadsword type data collections and analytics that without really isolating in some more effective way the personal stuff from that? I mean, if that makes any sense.
It is very tough, and this is why, for instance, and there is some kind of possibility today already. For instance, if you look at your general antivirus tools and so on, they will play on any email or any message, personal or not. This is a very basic kind of example, but it is, yes, you're right. You're going to enter into that zone, kind of where you're going to connect lots of data. Sometimes, and this is also a big issue, and this is one of the kind of big challenges of big data, you might try to re-identify previously, anonymous data or data that has been pseudonymized or whatever. You can kind of, with big data, you could potentially kind of re-identify those. So there's a host of things that might happen. Again, I think it is something where if you, in the design phase, look close enough kind of on what do I need, what do I like to achieve with this, and what do you have said to people, what have you said to people, you can get there. However, there's going to be a big difference between if you're talking about customer data, consumers' data, if you like, where you're profiling them or where you're promising them something, quid pro quo. You get a better discount if you give me that information. And we've seen in Europe, basically, that if you are very clear about what you want to do with the data and how it's protected and where they can go to if they have a question, people would tend to give more data. But that's in the customer world, where there's a clear quid pro quo and where the customer still has a very free choice to change of company or to change kind of supplier. In the employee environment, this is a little bit more touchy, and we've seen that, especially, for instance, in sectors like where you would least expect privacy to pop up, like manufacturing sector, where people want to know, for sometimes good reasons, for safety, for security, of what their employees are doing. And there they hit this kind of invasion of privacy vis-a-vis security measures. And that is, and you're absolutely right, that to balance their security and privacy compliance is a major challenge, and is a big difference how it is done in the States as it is done in Europe. And I think that those two are very opposed, where I think that the Asian, let's say the Asian regions, they're somewhere in the middle of this, and whereas Latin America is more kind of inclined to follow kind of Spain and Europe on that. So this is kind of where, if you're on a global scale, you will have that challenge.
Well, so let me progress this then, because I think what you've, and we can move to the next slide here. I think part of what we've established pretty clearly is, that there are these, and you use the paradox imagery very specifically, that we have this organizational security needs, we have individual privacy obligations, and that there's a way to get there, but it requires a little bit more effort than maybe U.S. companies are used to in the past having to worry about in the United States context. So our next question, and if we can progress to the next slide, is going to get us into maybe talking a little bit more about the kinds of practices or things we can do. And I want to just at this point say this is sort of our last structured question before we move more into future state and audience questions. So if any participant has any question for Erik, this would be a good time to make sure you get it into the queue, because we're going to transition into some other kinds of questions in a little bit. But with that said, Eric, maybe I could build upon, I know you've mentioned a couple times that it's not an existential demise. There is hope. There are ways of managing between these two, these two seemingly competing approaches. And are there some practices that you've found that that are particularly and some of them may just be things that strike you as common sense. They may not be big, fancy technical solutions. But what are the kinds of things you've seen that are that progressive or thoughtful companies are looking at in this area?
Well, there are a number of things. A few things that come to mind. First of all, and this is sometimes people think, will this relate to privacy or not? But one of the things that we see more and more companies do is really kind of looking at, if you look at the threats, the cyber, or call it cyber threats, the security threats, is to really do a more granular approach on that. And let me explain. If you take a bank, for instance, if you're in a retail bank, then phishing is a really concern, is a threat. Old granny sitting at their home banking side or his home banking side, not knowing if they're really at the bank they're supposed to be. That is a threat, and you need to do something about that. That threat is almost non-existent in corporate banking, in B2, bank to bank, whereas you have, standard telecommunication protocols and so on. So there you don't need to focus on that. That typical exercise to first look at kind of what are the threats for this division or this department, and then what am I going to put against it, will help you already to kind of in your defense on the proportionality principle, so that you're really adapting a little bit kind of how you go about it, vis-a-vis kind of how far you're going to take the invasion, if I kind of call it that way, on privacy with respect to employee monitoring, for instance. So to kind of first make that kind of analysis, I always say you need to do some kind of mapping. First of all, is with cyber, with threats, but also kind of with data mapping. We see a lot that clients think, or organizations think, they have already good idea where the data go. But when you look at it, then you see that the current data maps are what I call a lot one-dimensional. You know where the routers are, where the servers are, and so on, but you don't know who is actually accessing this data from a privacy perspective. Because remember, so you have to make a distinction, and this is something also to take into account and to balance it. Security is looking at integrity of data, is looking at access to data and confidentiality. Privacy, to a certain extent, does that as well, but adds one more layer to it, which is the usage of the data. Is it used for the purpose that you agreed to collect it, or that you told the person? If an employee, if you told the employee, I need your financial data, your bank account, your marital status, etc., because then I can pay you the correct salary and deduct all the social security and taxes, that is fine. But if you're going to use that same data for another purpose, or give it to not just HR but also others, that may not have been kind of correct, or was it told correctly. So these type of kind of first assessments is very important. The second thing is what I said before. I think when you do monitoring, when you do these implement security tools, kind of make sure that it's always done with a specific purpose, and also that limited people have access to it, or that you kind of compartmentalize who is monitoring what. Those are and finally, it's a no-brainer, but it is really kind of, we've seen that. I've been going on about works councils. We've seen in a lot of organizations where there's a good relationship with them, and you are transparent, and you're well ahead of the testing. You explain them why you're doing something. They can be very helpful into this. What they don't like is if something is sprung on them, or if something is not told. So again, that transparency kind of principle I was just talking about, and the timeliness of it is very important as well. I mean, there are a number of others, but those were the ones that really popped into my mind, given what I've seen in practice. And it's always the lack sometimes of communication, or the correct communication, is really a trigger for a lot of trouble. It's not the what, but it's the how. And that is a major thing in balancing security and privacy compliance.
It's interesting you bring up the, it sounds like strong relationships with the works councils in your organization seem so important. And I liked your imagery in the consumer marketplace where, there's this quid pro quo concept you mentioned where you're giving a benefit to the end consumer in exchange for being able to do more with their data. It sounds like the future could be interesting if you had this idea that there was some value you could provide to the employee, something they would value, in exchange for their willingness in the works councils to give a company a little more freedom to collect or to process data. And maybe part of that is just the employees being involved in the security challenge for the organization and being more bought in and being a part of wanting to help with that. I don't know if there's anything there. Do you see that as an area for, for companies to maybe do more work that maybe they're not doing so much today, or any ideas there?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you touched upon something very important, and this is something I didn't mention yet, but this is really, it's nothing to do with technology, but this is awareness. And this is not just training, but it's creating awareness on this. And then you can create a quid pro quo. I'll give you an example. We've been asked a few times for companies to basically do a social media and security awareness threat week. And the way this went was that we did this kind of 4 times in the week during a lunch hour for all employees. And the first 2 days, it had nothing to do with security threats to the company. It was all to do, we talked about the employee, and I'll take no credit for the idea because this was jointly done with the company itself. And it was a great idea. It was to first talk about, okay, you use it together with your children, with your partner, you use Facebook, you use LinkedIn, you use all of these type of things at home. And we explained them what the risks were and how you could mitigate some of the risks with the tools that already existed in these systems, for instance, what people didn't know. And we allowed them to ask questions. And then the second part of that week, we tied it then we tied it into their kind of business environment and why you would implement that security tool in order to safeguard that. And it was very powerful because we took first the employee to the place where it matters most for him or her. It's his private sphere. And then if you then say, well, listen, if you're now in your work sphere, it's a little bit the same. Only you will have more powerful tools, or the risks, the financial risks, will be even more heavier. And it was very powerful. And the last thing I want to say on this is, when we put this data protection audit of the European Data Protection Authority, a local data protection authority, one of the things a lot of companies fail is awareness. Because what I've seen is when a data protection officer, a regulator comes in, before they get to the office of the data protection officer, the compliance officer, whoever, who has really neatly everything ready for inspection, they will go left, right, and center in open space and ask a few simple questions to people that are in there, from who is your data protection officer or whatever, something like that. And if there's not enough sufficient awareness they get out of this, they'll say to you, well, this looks very nice, your training program, but nobody seems to know you, or nobody seems to know that exists. So there's something wrong there. So awareness is, I think, a very important tool that is undervalued, and where you can get or create a quid pro quo that you have in the consumer world with your employees with respect to security, balancing security and privacy.
I think this is such a consistently overlooked area. The basic idea of training and awareness is so interesting to me because we, in the security culture, I think, have grown up viewing often the employee as the source of our problems, right? It's their clicking on a link, it's their behavior that's causing our problems. And so rarely do we see them as part of the solution, and we're involving them, educating them, engaging them becomes a core part of our security strategy. So it sounds like this area is European privacy law is one more sort of strong use case for training and awareness programs.
I totally agree.
Well, so I think we're believe it or not, our time is already starting to sort of wind down here. So I want to just make sure we have the opportunity to take a couple of questions. If we can move to the next slide, I just want to highlight, that for anyone that wants the deck or receives the deck after, there's some examples here. And if we move to the next slide, we did have some future state questions, which I think, Erik, we've already been engaging in and touching on. As I look at some of the questions that have been submitted here, if there's anything on this page of future state questions that, let's see, around the balance shifting insecurity, I think, especially with recent events in Europe, you saw even in France in the aftermath of current events, this sort of increasing focus on security, at least at a minimum physical security in the country. And do you see some of those trends as potentially overshadowing topics of privacy and deprioritizing topics of privacy?
It's a very good question. My personal view is, the short answer is no. I think what you will see, there's two things here. First of all, of course, after terrible things that happened here in Europe, in France in particular, what happens, of course, is afterwards, when you ask the questions, kind of, do you need more police? Do you need more kind of information sharing and so on? That people will say, yes, of course, we want to be more safe. When you go back a couple of months later, especially here in Europe, where we're kind of also, I don't like to use that term, but we're kind of used to terrorism, and I'm really using that very carefully. But I mean, we've had, in Ireland, we've had a number of countries, in Spain with the Basque and all that. People kind of know about this. I think what will happen, and this won't have an effect on privacy. It will have an effect on what is currently already in the legal framework, that is better cooperation between police forces, better sharing of information. The legal framework for that already coexists with privacy rules and allows for that. However, in practice, it's not been done effectively yet. And now I mean between police forces in a country and between kind of police forces throughout Europe. I think that will improve. I think that will, and legal will do more like that. There will be more kind of checks at airports, or more elaborate kind of sharing of information. That will continue to go on. However, the right to privacy itself, I think, is embedded in a lot of people's culture. Look at kind of whistleblowing kind of hotlines and so on. Look at surveillance in general. I don't think that will have an influence on it. I think it have an influence on kind of giving more power or more kind of means to law enforcement to be more effective. But I don't think it will have an impact on kind of this means that we have to give up even more privacy, because I don't think that will happen. But that's my personal view.
I appreciate that. Well, let me ask one question that came in that was, and I'm not even sure that this is true, but I want to ask the question: is there that European authorities are looking to expand their jurisdiction over U.S. companies, even those potentially that don't have branches or offices or facilities in the EU? What does this mean for companies based outside of Europe? And so you'll have to start by just saying, is that in fact true? And if so, what are the implications of that?
It is to a certain extent true, because what the new regulation is all about, and what has been kind of been growing since the last directive in other kind of legislative bodies, is that you don't need a server, or you don't need an establishment anymore in Europe to fall under the new regulation. If you are kind of processing data of somebody in Europe, and you're aiming at that as well, that would be sufficient to trigger the regulation. So in that sense, if you call it, it is extra. It's larger, However, it's always going to be the devil in the detail how to enforce something like that. But it is, their idea is indeed that regardless if you have a server, people think in first instance, or authorities think in first instance, I think you have that in the States as well with online casinos and all of that type of activity in a first. But they will be looking at if you're handling data of people residing in Europe, then you will need to abide by that regulation. And of course, there's going to be some collision, and there's going to be some questions about international law. But at this moment in time, it is true that that's the aim.
Well, so this has been so valuable for me. I really, I miss not having the opportunity to, ask you my questions, Erik, as much as I did when I was still with Deloitte, and having you as my safety net, my warm, tickly blanket, so to speak, when I'm confronted with complex EU problems. If Sarah, you could advance one more slide, I just want to leave it with, and Erik, I hope I should have probably asked more clear permission before I put your contact information up here, but maybe this will set up what would be one last question for you, which would be, if people wanted to sort of stay abreast of what's happening with EU privacy requirements as the regulation keeps working its way through, short of engaging Deloitte, which always would be the first choice to get good advice and consulting around this topic, are there any other resources or suggestions you would make for individuals and organizations trying to make sure they understand what their obligations are?
I think there are a number of them. I think definitely always the European Commission's side itself, or some of the national regulators. I'm just thinking about the UK, for instance. I'm thinking about even France and Germany. Also, they have very kind of good, comprehensive and in English kind of guidelines or clarifications with articles. So they're always a good source. With respect to closer to my home, so to speak, we're very proud that we are the host of the European Privacy Academy out of Brussels, where we train data protection officers basically in a very pragmatic and holistic way. So that is also that type of and it's an online group that comes out there where we provide news flashes and so on. That is also an opportunity, a possibility. This is where we just coordinate and where we just moderate on that. So I think those are kind of definitely already sources that you can kind of go to. But I think especially national regulators of the main countries, and I think if you look at UK, Germany, France, and Spain, those are already kind of indicators of where things are going. Following on the EU Commission, the Article 29 Working Group, and what they kind of establish as policy guidelines, gives you also a good indication of where things are going. So I think those are definitely good places to look, I would say.
That's great. And Erik, for anyone that's, with respect to the Privacy Academy and some of the work you're doing, if they wanted to get more information, should they reach out to you directly, or how would you suggest they get that information?
Absolutely. I mean, you have my email, there's anything there. I also, if people are interested, we do have kind of also a list of a few of those sources that I can, render a little bit more kind of concrete. So I'll be happy to share that information, or if they have more information, yes, feel free to contact me directly.
Well, I know that it is getting pretty late at night where you are, and I want to make sure that I take this opportunity to thank you for engaging in this live discussion webinar with us today. And if there's any last thoughts or observations you'd like to share, to close us out and wrap this up, I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I again thank you so much for your time. Any last thoughts or observations before we wrap it up?
I think it's been said all. I think what we've seen in Europe, first of all, when you're not from Europe, consider that the European Union, forget the you're talking about privacy, and especially employee privacy. Unfortunately, consider every country a little bit on its own. There is a way to provide benchmarking kind of solutions, and there's a lot of here good and bad of the works councils and the whole of this regulatory kind of framework. The bad thing sometimes is it's not that clear. The good thing is there's a lot to be done. It's not black and white, and if you have a good communication, it can go a long way. So I think those things are really kind of very important. Timeliness and open communication will get you far with definitely implementing some of the well-known security tools and avoids a lot of discussion and animosity afterwards.
Well, and there you have it. That was Erik Luysterborg from Deloitte's EMEA privacy leader from their privacy and data protection practice, or I guess now cyber risk services. Is that a global name, or is that just in the U.S.? That
it's now a global name. Yes, I lead the cyber risk services group in Belgium, and then the EMEA data protection and privacy.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm with that going to wrap it up. And I again appreciate your time, and good night to you, Erik.
Thank you.